الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد ذي القدر العظيم وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. In our lessons on Maraqi al-Falah, Sharh Nullifiers from the section on prayer, we have reached the things that invalidate the prayer. And we looked at a very practical section on what the follower does after the prayer, right? And the adhkar that have come after the prayer, etc. For those of you who are students of knowledge, dedicated students of knowledge, there are many useful points at the end of the section that are mentioned in the Hashiyah of Imam al-Tahtawi. And before we start today's section on what invalidates the prayer, we'll just look briefly at some of these points. So amongst the points that Imam al-Tahtawi rahimahullah mentions is that what is better, making dhikr quietly or out loud? And there's ikhtilaf amongst the ulama about that, right? Right? So it has come that khairu dhikr al-khafi, the best of dhikr is that which is done silently. They said that's because of it being sincere, right? And right? And there are many evidences that are mentioned regarding the permissibility of raising one's voice with dhikr, right? And he mentions a number of quotes from that, and about that the ulama across the ages have deemed it permissible and praiseworthy to have circles of dhikr in the masajid, but not in ways that inconvenience or distract the regular congregation, right? And so it's a matter where, right, right? He also discusses the issue of the use of the Duff, right? And there's a range of opinions as well, right? And some of these, Ibn Abdin tackles them more rigorously than here, but there's useful points. Many of these that are mentioned here by Imam Tahtawi, if you have Nahlawi's Ad-Durr al-Mubaha, you find very good discussion there. Right? And there's also some fiqh related to shaking hands there, right? That shaking hands, musafaha, is a sunnah at all times, right? And it's related in the sunnah of Abu Dawud from Abu Dharr that I never met the Prophet ﷺ except that I shook his hands. And he also mentioned that he once hugged him. So hugging is a more specific sunnah, right? And they mention that shaking hands should be with the whole hand, not just with the fingers, kind of thing. And as for kissing, they said it's makruh, for a man to kiss another man on the mouth. As for kissing the hands, there's tafsil, right? Right? And they said, so غاية البيان, he quotes from غاية البيان, from al-Waqi'at, that kissing the hands of a scholar or a just ruler is permissible. And there's a hadith that are mentioned regarding it, right? Even more so, it's come in the Adab al-Mufrad of Imam al-Bukhari and elsewhere that the Sahaba would kiss both the hands of the Prophet ﷺ and his feet. There's actually a chapter in Al-Adab al-Mufrad of Imam al-Bukhari about that. And the Prophet ﷺ would kiss Al-Hasan and Fatima, right? And the Prophet ﷺ kissed Uthman ibn Mad'un after his death, right? And Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq kissed the Prophet ﷺ after he passed away, alayhi salatu wassalam, right? The Prophet ﷺ kissed the son of his uncle, Sayyidina Ja'far al-Tayyar, between his, between his eyes, on his forehead. Likewise, so these are establish the permissibility of from Badruddin al-Aini said, from this we see that it's permitted to kiss someone else's hands or other parts of the body if it's done in a good way and to honor them or to express love, but not out of desire nor out of a blameworthy meaning, right? 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 And there's details there. So there's some good points, but and likewise, standing up for someone who comes, or standing up out of respect, is not in itself disliked, but it's disliked if someone loves to be stood for. But that's not something that you can know, because you cannot know other people's intentions. And it goes back to urf, to custom, where it's an indicator of respect to stand for others, then it would be considered religiously recommended to stand for them, because it leads to, and there's precedent in the Sunnah for both the permissibility and the praiseworthiness of standing out of respect. So he addresses some of these issues. They're really well summarized in both the Hadith al-Ala'iyya and Nahlawi, but you see there's some good discussions there, and if questions arise, we can take them separately. So now we reach Babu Ma Yufsidu as-Salah. Right? Right? And here, ma yufsidu as-salah, in worship, in ibadat, fasad and butlan have the same meaning. Right? Which is, and this is nice, in the opening of Hashid ibn Abdin in this section, he explains, because what's meant by fasad, by corruption, literally, or butlan, invalidation, is that which takes the act of worship away from being an act of worship due to some obligatory element being unfulfilled. Right? Right? As opposed to in transactions where they distinguish between fasad, right, which is masahha fi aslihi duna wasfihi, that which is sound in its core but not in its essential characteristics, right? And the batil ma lam yasihha fi aslihi, and the invalid is that whose core is not not sound. So distinguish between that. And we see that in mu'amalat. So it says, ما يفسد الصلاة, that which invalidates the prayer. Underlying it are a few principles. You have what invalidates the prayer, and then you have what is disliked in the prayer, right? What is disliked in the prayer. And, right? So what invalidates the prayer, right? They give a whole list of things, but ultimately it's there's invalidators of commission or omission. Of commission, which is al-amalul kathir. But the ones that invalidate by action are excessive action, whether physical actions or words. And he begins with words because that's the most tangible, immediate action, because it's the easiest to address, because no speech is allowed, right? And then and the amal al-kathir, there's lots of underlying points. We will take those step by step. Then you have those of omission, right? Which is where a condition is not fulfilled, right? Now, if you started with the condition unfulfilled, you haven't started. But conditions, that's why they break down conditions into different types, right? As came in the beginning of the work. But the conditions broadly, the core conditions need to remain during the prayer. You don't just have to be clothed within the prayer, like you can't drop your pants mid-prayer, right? This is obvious. You can't say, okay, I began the prayer facing the Qibla, let me now face the other way because the sun is shining. No, of course you can't do that, right? So, it's fawatu shartin aw rukn, right? By not fulfilling a condition or an integral, right? Broadly, that's what it goes back to. But the fuqaha don't like the merely theoretical. Said, okay, khalas, let's just summarize the chapter. What more do you need to say? Because the nature of fiqh is that it affects people regularly and people need clarity to give bayan to them. So they detail these. Broadly, there are principles that we've highlighted before about al-amal al-kathir, al-abath, and al-amal al-qalil. Amal al-kathir, excessive action, breaks the prayer. Al-abath, fidgeting, and what's at the level of fidgeting is makruh tahriman. And these are both sinful categories. And then you have al-amal al-qalil bila fa'ida is makruh tanzihan. And wad'u al-salah is al-khushu' wal-khudu', is to have khushu', to have reverence, and to be humbled. Right? وَأَقِمِ الصَّلَاةَ لِذِكْرِي, establish the prayer for my remembrance. قُومُوا لِلَّهِ قَانِتِينَ, stand for Allah, reverent. الَّذِينَ هُمْ فِي صَلَاتِهِمْ khashi'un, those who are in their prayers humbled or reverently humbled, right? So he says babu ma yufsidu as-salah. قال رحمه الله تعالى الفساد ضد الصلاح. Corruption is the opposite of salah, of soundness, right? 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 And fasada is said in a number of ways, right? So Maulana al-Tahtawi points this out quite usefully from the Qamus. He said, fasada ka nasara. Nasara yansuru, fasada yafsudu. Wa aqada. Aqada yaqidu. So be fasada yafsidu. Karuma yakrumu. Fasada yafsudu. Right? There's a few ways. But normally people say yafsud. Right? But there's different ways. He says, وَالْفَسَادُ وَالْبُطْلَانُ فِي الْعِبَادَاتِ سَيَّان. Corruption and invalidation in worship are the same, because they indicate the prayer no longer, the act of worship no longer being considered an act of worship due to an obligatory element being missing, or because the act of worship enters your dhimma. When the action is invalid, this act was not a recognized way of removing what entered your dues, your dhimma, from your dues. وفي المعاملات كالبيع مفترقان. But in transactions like sales, they differ. Right? And we touched upon that briefly in the opening. وحصر المفسد بالعد تقريبا لا تحديدا. وحصر المفسد بالعد تقريبا لا تحديدا فقال. So the author rahimahullah ta'ala gave a number of the actions that corrupt the prayer in an approximative way, not in a specifying way. So he said, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, right? And he's talking about himself in the third person, right? Which is not unusual, right? So he says, وَهُوَ ثَمَانِيَةٌ وَسِتُّونَ شَيْئًا. There are 68 things. مِنْهُ الْكَلِمَةِ. From them is to say a word. Right? وَإِن لَمْ تَكُنْ مُفِيدَةً كَيَا. Even if to say a word, أي ما تألف من كلمتين فأكثر. Right? And this is where one falls in love with, or it's easy to fall in love with the tanweer, because of Imam al-Tumurtashi, right? And because he has expresses himself really, tanweer with the dur, right? With the dur here, he says at-takallum, right? So al-kalima, by a word, right? So he says هو النطق بحرفين أو حرف مفهم, right? Right? It is to utter بحرفين, 2 letters, أو حرف مفهم, or one letter that conveys a meaning. So it's to utter. So it has to be uttered, right? It has to be uttered. And we took what that entails. You said it such that it's audible to yourself at least. He says بالكلمة, a complete word, which is ما تألف من حرفين فأكثر أو حرفا مفهما, made up of 2 letters, 2 discernible letters, or 1 letter that conveys a meaning. In Arabic, there are such letters, qi, from wiqaya, etc. وَإِن لَمْ تَكُنْ مُفِيدَةً. Someone just said, khoo, Is there a word called hu? No, but it breaks the prayer. Okay? وَلَوْ نَطَقَ بِهَا سَهْوًا, even if uttered forgetfully. The forgetfulness lifts the sin, but does not lift the invalidation. Just as if someone was sleeping and you poured water down their throat, for sure, and they know with certainty, you recorded it and had witnesses. What happens to the person's fast? It's invalidated. Did they sin from it? No. So certain errors lift sin, right? Unless it can be considered from the actions of prayer, right? Like you weren't addressing someone. Someone sneezed 4 times, said, "Oh Lord, oh Lord, oh Lord," right? But "Oh Lord, oh Lord, oh Lord" is just English for saying "Ya Rab, Ya Rab, Ya Rab," right? So now we shouldn't do things like that, but that which would be considered from the prayer does not break it, right? Forgetfully how? يظن كونه ليس في الصلاة. Like if you imagine you're no longer praying, right? You're standing so long behind the Imam in a silent prayer, the Imam was reciting Surah Al-Baqarah, and you forgot you're in the prayer. You said to yourself, "I wonder what's for lunch." Oh my God, I was praying. Just forgetfully, it breaks your prayer. Okay? It's possible someone in a quiet prayer recited very long, right? أو نطق بها خطأ, or you said it quietly. You're praying, and your wife said, "I'm going to the new steakhouse." In prayer, "Don't go without me." Breaks your prayer. It's a khata. It lifts sin, does not lift the invalidation. كما لو أراد أن يقول يا أيها الناس, such as if they wanted to say يا أيها الناس in the prayer. فقال يا زيد or يا يزيد, they said, "Oh Yazid." ولو جهل كونه مفسدا, even if one was unaware that it breaks the prayer. ولو نائما, even if asleep. So someone fell asleep. Now you'd only know it for sure if someone told you. في المختار, according to the chosen opinion, right? And there's an opinion from Fakhr al-Islam that it doesn't break the prayer. So there's a position that it doesn't. If someone said something while asleep within the prayer, there is an opinion that it doesn't break the prayer. But it's not the opinion chosen by most of the ulama. Right? Those things, don't run fiqhi experiments yourself. Things like that, check before you answer on such things. That's fatwa. لقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم إن هذه الصلاة لا يصلح فيها شيء من كلام الناس. Indeed, this prayer of ours, no human speech befits it. Right? Right? And what لا يصلح فيها, truly this prayer of ours, no human speech befits it, meaning it's not permitted within it. Right? Right? It's not permitted within it, i.e. if you do it, it would break your prayer. And it goes back, of course, it goes against the prayer that is commanded in the Quran. Right? These verses that we've mentioned, right? وَقُومُوا لِلَّهِ قَانِتِينَ الَّذِينَ هُمْ فِي صَلَاتِهِمْ خَاشِعُونَ. Right? Many other verses from which it's explained that you have to stand reverently before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Everything that كل ما يخل بأصل الخشوع أو أصل القيام بين يدي الرب فيفسد وما لا يليق فهو مكروه. Right? Right? So that which is unbefitting before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but that which cannot be done, when you are standing reverently, invalidates the prayer, and the fuqaha deduced from this sunnah what those things are, and that which is improper to do before your Lord when you're fully turned to Him, right? So imagine you're called, okay, come here. So someone comes, said, okay, what do you have to say? Now you're standing, addressing the king, so you're looking around, etc. That's unbecoming. And you turn away, khalas, you've turned away from, right? And there's hadiths about that as well, that that when one of you stands to pray, they are turned fully towards their Lord. So then the Prophet ﷺ said a number of things not to do as a result. Right? And these indications are there both in the Quranic verses about the prayer and in the hadiths about the prayer. So from all of them collectively, from the Quranic verses, individually decisively, sometimes by their indication or allusion, sometimes explicitly, but just people don't realize it, and very clearly throughout the hadiths on how to pray. From all of those decisively, this is what was understood. Truly this prayer of ours, no human speech befits. This prayer of ours, no human speech befits it. وَالْعَمَلُ الْقَلِيلُ. But then a question arises, that if you can do a little bit of action, why can't you speak a little bit? So there's an implicit question here. Right? So this is a جواب سؤال مقدر. Right? It's the answer to an implicit question. العمل القليل عفو لعدم الاحتراز عنه أي دون مشقة. Slight action is excused by the lawgiver, because it is exceedingly difficult to avoid. You're standing, it's difficult not to twitch a little bit, whatever. It's hard, but it's easy just to keep quiet. وَيُفْسِدُهَا الدُّعَاءُ بِمَا يُشْبِهُ كَلَامَنَا. The prayer is invalidated by supplication that resembles our words, أي كلام الناس. Right? وَهُوَ كُلُّ مَا يُمْكِنُ طَلَبُهُ مِنَ النَّاسِ, which is everything that you can ask from a human being. Right? 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 So الدعاء بما يشبه كلامنا. Right? Ibn Abidin. So we looked at this in the Sunan al-Salah, but he gives a good definition. وَمَا لَيْسَ فِي الْقُرْآنِ وَلَا فِي السُّنَّةِ وَلَا يَسْتَحِيلُ طَلَبُهُ مِنَ الْعِبَادِ. Right? So there's three criteria. Right? 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 So if it's in the Quran, it doesn't invalidate, even if you conceivably could ask someone else the same thing. ولا في السنة, nor in the Sunnah. ولا يستحيل طلبه nor is it impossible to ask of it from people. And we looked at it in the sunnahs of prayer, so you can look at it further there. Right? فالدعاء بما يشبه كلامنا. So he gives an example. نحو اللهم ألبسني ثوب كذا. Oh Allah, grant me to wear such and such garment. Right? أطعمني كذا. So you really feel like steak. So you say اللهم أطعمني الsteak. Breaks your prayer. Because you could just ask your husband, your wife, your friend, or you could go to the place and say, I'd like some steak. Right? أو اقضي ديني, or fulfill my debt. Now there's an issue there that this is not accepted. بل وارد. Right? So this, and we've looked at it before, right? He used that as an example also in the Sunan of prayer. وَالدُّعَاء بِمَا لَيْشْبِهُ كَلَامَ النَّاسِ قضاء الدين, because it's in the hadith. Or وَاقْضِ عَنِّي الدَّيْن, right? Multiple. اقضي عني الدين. There's a number of hadiths. So that's something that's asked. أو ارزقني فلانا. Rizq is only from Allah. So these two are both right? But it's best. So if you say warzuqni al-khair, if you ask for general rizq, but when you use rizq that oh Allah grant me, so rizq, provide for me so and so, right? That you could ask for from a human being, right? على الصحيح, because there's خلاف. لأنه يمكن تحصيله من العباد, because you could ask for it from people. بخلاف قولي اللهم عافني واعف عني وارزقني. Oh Allah, grant me wellness, overlook on my behalf. ارزقني, grant me rizq. And we've taken the detail of how, it's best to be careful in what you ask for within the prayer. After the prayer, ask for whatever you wish. ويفسدها السلام بنية التحية ولو ساهيا. The prayer is invalidated by giving salams with the intention of greeting. Greeting someone outside of the prayer. Right? It's not invalidated by if you give salam with the intention of ending the prayer, and then you realize you're not in the prayer, that salam does not invalidate the prayer. That takes you out of the prayer, but there still remains a connection to the prayer, so you are able to return. وَلَوْ سَاهِيًا, even if forgetful, even if you just say, he says, بِنِيَةِ التَّحِيَّة, with the near of greeting someone else, تحية الغير, وَلَّمْ يَقُلْ عَلَيْكُمْ, even if you say السلام, without saying السلام عليكم, even if you say السلام, it would break the prayer. وَلَوْ كَانَ سَاهِيًا, even if forgetfully, لأنه خطاب, because it's address. وَيُفْسِدُهَا رَدُّ السَّلَامِ بِلِسَانِهِ, and the prayer is invalidated by answering the salam with one's tongue. وَلَوْ سَهْوًا لِأَنَّهُ مِنْ كَلَامِ النَّاسِ, even if forgetfully, because it's from human speech. And it also goes against what is the building block of the prayer? How is the prayer begun? With the tahrima. It's called the tahrima. It's been called the tahrima in the sunnah because it makes everything from outside the prayer impermissible within the prayer. أو, right? أو رد السلام, answering the salam with one's tongue. أو رد السلام بالمصافحة, or to answer the salam by shaking hands. لأنه كلام معنى, because it has the meaning of speech. Another reasoning that's given is that maybe, and Tahtawi says this is better, And he relies there on a Sayyid, Abu Sa'ud, right? Who's accompanying us in the Kanz class, right? Or we're accompanying him. That the better reasoning may be to say لأنه عمل كثير, because it's excessive action. Because saying it's كلام معنى, the problem would be if you shake hands, if it's considered كلام, then the problem would be that as we took raising your hands for ishara, does it break the prayer? No. They said, well, that's istihsan. The qiyas would be this should break your hands too. Break your hands. Astaghfirullah. Break your prayer. But the reason it doesn't is it's istihsan bin nas, because it's established in the hadith that it doesn't break. وَيُفْسِدُهَا الْعَمَلُ الْكَثِيرُ. The prayer is also invalidated. This is by excessive action. العمل الكثير. By excessive action. لا القليل. And this is the basis. Right? This is the basis. Now, the Hanafis were, the basis is that we know that action is not allowed in the prayer. Any action is disliked. There's a certain threshold when you would not be considered praying. So your prayer is invalid. What is that threshold where you're not considered praying? When you're not considered praying. Whose opinion counts? The person affected. There's no specific miqdar mentioned in the Sharia, but there's 6 major definitions of it. The one he mentions is the preferred. I think Tahtawi mentions a bunch of them. Right? So he says, يفسدها العمل الكثير لا القليل والفاصل بينهما أن الكثير هو الذي لا يشك الناظر لفاعله أنه ليس في الصلاة. This is the onlooker criteria. The excessive action breaks the prayer, not slight action. Excessive action is action that an onlooker would not doubt that you are not praying. And Tahtawi mentioned something very important from Ibn Amir Hajj al-Halabi, the author of Halbat al-Mujalli, Sharh Munyat al-Musalli, that but by what's meant by the onlooker is someone who doesn't know that you are in the prayer. Right? Because someone knows you're praying and you're doing wacky stuff, say he's praying but he's doing wacky stuff. Right? Right? So and there's some interesting furu' in Tahtawi. You could read them. They're a bit embarrassing. I'm not going to quote them here. وَإِنْ اشْتَبَهَ فَهُوَ قَلِيلٌ. If it's unclear, then it is slight. عَلَى الْأَصَحِ. There's an opinion that caution would entail, deeming it invalid. Right? But this is the majority opinion. Right? And in this, At-Tahtawi relies on what's mentioned in Tabyin al-Haqaiq, important reference. Okay. And he quotes the Mudmarat. It's also an important work. Right? Okay. And this is the relied upon definition. The rest, huwa al-asah. This is the soundest of multiple definitions. The other definitions tried to capture what would be considered amal kathir, facilitatively. وقيل في تفسيره من غير قيل في تفسيره غير هذا. Other things have been mentioned to explain what is amal kathir, كالحركات الثلاث المتواليات, like 3 consecutive motions. And then different. What about 3 minor motions? What if you twitch your shoulder 3 times? Right? Is that excessive action? Right? So, right? If I'm praying and I went like this, you see me move my shoulder? But is this major? And then what do you mean by consecutive? Is my twitching it forward one movement and bringing it back another? Right? What if I twitch my shoulder and move my neck and straighten my back? So in one motion, if I did, are those 3 motions or 1? As opposed to I went like this, right? So, so this is harder to apply, right? So كالحركات الثلاث المتواليات كثير ودونها قليل. That, and less than 3 consecutive motions is a lot, less than that is a little. And there's other definitions. That which requires 2 hands is a lot. Right, and here there's a useful note. Tahtawi mentions different points, but then he mentioned something useful from the author, from Shurun Bulali. He says, قال المصنف وفروعهم في هذا الباب قد اختلفت. The legal details derived by the ulama in this chapter on what breaks the prayer of al-amal al-kathir differ. Not all of لم تتفرع كلها على قول واحد. Not all of them are derived from the same opinion as to what the definition of excessive action are. والظاهر أن أكثرها تفريعات من المشايخ. And what's evident is most of these are derived from the mashayikh, I mean the scholars of the madhab. ولم تكن منقولة عن الإمام الأعظم, and they're not related from the Imam. Right? So we know al-amal al-kathir, but then what defines the amal al-kathir? So depending on what definition you take, you'll have differences on the derivative rulings from that. ويكره رفع اليدين عند إرادة الركوع والرفع عندنا لا يفسد على الصحيح. It is makruh to raise one's hands when one goes into ruku' or rising from ruku', but this does not invalidate the prayer. It's not excessive motion. Because some people said that amal kathir is 3 consecutive motions. You go 1, 2, but you moved 1 hand, 1 movement, 2 movements, 3 movements, 4 movements. Or 1, 2, and then inevitably they swing a little before or after. Excessive motion. No. Right? And this caused a bit of fitna with one of the most colorful scholars in the Hanafi madhab, al-Itqani. And the Hanafis really soured on him, unfortunately, because of this. And this is the sahih. Some, so it doesn't break the prayer. Some of our attitudinally divergent brethren like quoting things like this, like there are Hanafi who said it breaks the prayer. Nobody accepted it. And also, they say ما يذكر مناظرة لا يشترط أن يكون مذهبا لأنه قد يذكر على طريق الإلزام. That which is mentioned in argument is not necessarily someone's madhab, because it could just be made to force something on someone else, right? Like if someone says more than 2 consecutive motions break the prayer, or the unnecessary movements of prayer. You guys raise your hands. That should break your prayer. Now, you shouldn't debate in that kind of way, but something that's mentioned in argument does not necessarily mean that that's the actual position, right? Those things are lost to people, so just it was said, and sometimes, ulama make mistakes, and there's hardly some individual ulama who said to the contrary. But بطريق الإلزام is in the context of debate. And then there's debate of a background. There's people attacking the Hanafis over a dozen issues. So they say, look, if you want to apply the same principles to you, that if you take what we say and interpret it in wrong ways, then we can take what you say and interpret it in wrong ways, and we'd come up with these conclusions. Are you satisfied with these conclusions? No. Therefore, please don't say those things. And let's resolve this argument. Right? So that's and many things are done like that. And even some books are written like that. They're not written for just anybody. One of the books that's written like that is it's an important work. A couple of works of Imam al-Kawthari can shock the wits out of people. I'm not going to mention their names. I asked Shaykh Muhammad Juma about them, said they have an important ilmi function, but he explained that, look, this is how they are. It was called Tariqatul Ilzam, which is one of the ways of debate. And the summary of it is that someone makes an excessive argument against you. That argument is based on principles. They say, okay, you identify what's the line of reasoning. You say, okay, if I were to apply that line of reasoning to your opinions, I would come up with these conclusions. Do you accept those conclusions? No. Therefore, if you don't want me to ascribe those conclusions to you, then please retract what you are saying about me, because it's based on the same line of legal reasoning. Or me or whoever. So it's a very effective line of legal reasoning, right? But it can lead to colorful statements sometimes, right? But those things are not being affirmed, right? So one of the cases, and don't read the book, at least certainly not now, because it requires more ilmi maturity. One of the great scholars of hadith and a great imam of hadith, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, had great contributions in the science of hadith, al-Khatib al-Baghdadi. In one of his great works of history, he has a huge section on the biography of Abu Hanifa. But then he gathered pretty much all that was said attacking Abu Hanifa. And he's a muhaddith. He relates it with chains of transmission, but that section is pretty much all forgeries. And sometimes the ulama do things to identify, look, these things are said about Abu Hanifa, but look, I'm mentioning the chains to you, because they say, Man asnada faqad ahal. One who mentions an isnad has transferred responsibility. So you can, sort of although it's a bit hard, to be honest, but it is possible to make an excuse for al-Khatib about it. Especially if you consider that before it and elsewhere he has effusive praise of Abu Hanifa as well. So and then people came in the age of fitan, the end of times are the age of fitna. People came and they published just the critique of Imam Abu Hanifa from al-Khatib al-Baghdadi without the longer praise by the same author of him. Anyways, they published just that. They published a whole bunch of other stuff. Finding something, someone said Abu Hanifa was kafir, outrageous, outlandish things. Falsely ascribing treatises to different people, attacking Abu Hanifa. So Imam al-Kawthari went into a defense mode. So he used this principle that if you could apply, if someone could criticize Abu Hanifa based on fabricated hadiths that are related but with false chains of transmission. So he found, and Imam al-Kawthari had an incredible memory. Right? He had access to manuscripts. Like, people thought he was making things up. And it was freakish, the kind of memory he had, the recollection he had, but also the access to manuscripts that he had, rahimahullah, in a very difficult age. Anyways, so he came up with a devastating attack on al-Khatib. He's not attacking al-Khatib. He's just saying, if this could be used to attack Imam Abu Hanifa through baseless transmissions, then I could find all kinds of baseless transmissions attacking al-Khatib. Now, it's important because they are attitudinally divergent and unaware people who say that al-Kawthari accused al-Khatib of 1, 2, and 3. This is buhtan. This is buhtan. He did not. Otherwise, it would say that the believers say that we are misguided because we're commanded to say that either we are on manifest guidance or on manifest misguidance. Are we saying we're on manifest misguidance? No. Right? And that's why one of the adab of a talib al-ilm is that to appreciate, and that's why logic is studied, there is tasawwur and tasdeeq. You have to soundly conceive of something, and then you make a judgment about it. But even if, say, well, let me be careful about that, that's a judgment. Right? So even before conceiving of something, making tasawwur of it, you have to ask, هل هذا ينفع? Is it of benefit? If it isn't, you don't need to have you don't even have to understand the issue. Before making a hukum on it, and caution is a hukum too, right? You can say, I want to keep away from this shit, but say, let me be careful about fulan, al-itqani. I don't like him because he said strange things. Do you know what he said? No. Then what are you doing? Just say, I don't know. Let me stick to what is better. That's safe. It's a subtle matter. So anyways, so there's a whole story behind this. بطلان الرفع من الركوع. And some Hanafis also got a bit over the top against those who mentioned that. And most of what happened about that is in the context of munadhara, of debate and ilzam. Okay. ويفسدها تحويل الصدر عن القبلة. The prayer is invalidated by moving one's chest away from the qibla. بتركه فرض التوجه إلا لسبق حدث أو لاصطفاف حراسة بإزاء العدو في صلاة الخوف. It's invalidated by turning the chest away from the qibla, meaning away from the direction of the qibla. Right? So someone moves slightly, but they're still within the direction of the qibla, it doesn't break it. If you move, أي عن جهة القبلة, right? عن القبلة أي جهتها, right? جهتها لغير المعين, right? Right? And this is tahweel, it's moving. Right? We'll see what happens if one stumbled or if one was pushed away from the qibla, then إذا تحول, then if you can bring your chest back in the direction within the direction of the qibla within 3 tasbihs, it doesn't break. Except if you're overcome by an invalidator of wudu, يعني ما يصح به البناء, right? Or in the prayer of fear, if you go to line up to face the enemy, right? As we'll see in the Salat al-Khawf, right? Because that's textually established. ويفسدها أكل شيء من خارج فمه ولو قل. And it's invalidated by eating something from outside one's mouth, even if it be a little. كسمسمة, like a sesame seed. لإمكان الاحتراز عنه, because it is possible to avoid. Right? ويفسدها أكل ما بين أسنانه. And it's invalidated by eating what is between one's teeth, إن كان كثيرا, if it's a lot. وهو أي الكثير قدر حمصة. Right? And a lot is that which is more than the extent of a himmisa. Right? Now you'll hear that qadr al-him, it's often pronounced hummus, etc. But this is where you should, even words that are commonly used, don't assume that the classical pronunciation and the contemporary pronunciation are the same. Simple. Keep the dictionaries handy. Right? So the extent of a dried pea. ولو بعمل قليل, even if it be with slight movements. لإمكان الاحتراز عنه. Right? Because it's possible to avoid a lot. بخلاف القليل, as opposed to a little. بعمل قليل, even with a little action. لأنه تبع لريقه, because that follows their saliva. You know, there's stuff in your mouth, gets dislodged, it's with your saliva, it's very hard to avoid it. وإن كان بعمل قليل فسد بالعمل. If it's with a lot of action, it breaks. So during the prayer, you got like a piece of meat, you take it, like someone sees what you're doing, they didn't think you're in the prayer, right? So that's because of the amal kathir. نسأل الله العافية. Now here, when they mention the reasoning, لإمكان الاحتراز, because it's avoidable, you will find the answer to what if you're in a rainstorm or a sandstorm, right? And something got in your mouth and you just couldn't avoid it, because هذا لا يمكن الاحتراز عنه. You're locked outdoors in a sandstorm. And you're reciting and you've covered your mouth, but now, can you pray without swallowing even once? Some people, they can't. I don't know what are all people. So you feel you've swallowed more than the small amount. You swallowed a little bit from the outside, but ما لا يمكن الاحتراز عنه فهو محفو عنه. Right? That which is unavoidable is excused. There are other opinions beyond the qadr al-himmisa, right? But they're weak. Now don't give fatwa on those, right? Among them, Imam Khawahir Zahid said, anything less than a mouthful doesn't break the prayer if it's from within the mouth. But what's mentioned here is superior, right? And there's a few useful points in the commentary. لو أكل شيئا من الحلاوة, if one ate something sweet, right? أي قبل الصلاة, right? وابتلع عينها, and one swallowed the sweet itself, right? And this is قبل الصلاة, right? Before the prayer. ووجد حلاوتها في فيه, and one found its sweetness in one's mouth. وابتلعها, and one swallows this residue, just the taste, right? So you got a chocolate bar. Now you can feel the taste of the chocolate bar in your mouth. هذا قليل. You keep swallowing it, right? ولو أدخل الفانيد أو السكر, you got something sweet, you put it in your mouth, and it keeps affecting your saliva on an ongoing basis, and you keep swallowing the saliva, this breaks your prayer. If you chew gum, and ilk here is natural gum, so it does not have, it's not got sugar or syrup in it, right? So ilkan, and some put here, ilkan, they put here, mamdughan, chewed. Because even classical, even natural gum has some, some of its juiciness, right? And there's different types of natural gums. We don't need to get into that. I asked in Damascus, one of the grocers says, and he'd studied with the ulama. You know the ilka that the ulama mentioned? Can you get me some? He says, يعني النوع القديم, said the old type. I said, yes. So he got me this really cheapo, like if regular, I forget how much they cost like 10 cents. There was this like even he said, this is the kind of stuff the Shaykh used to give us when we were young. And it looked awful. Like it was like a chewing gum, but it was in a very cheap box. I said, no. So I said, okay, it was the wrong person to ask. So then I went to ask some of the mashayikh, what do they call this thing that the mashayikh mentioned in the books? What do they call it? He said, no, you can't just get it anywhere. You have to go to these places that sell natural products. If you ask them for this, You might be able to find it. Alhamdulillah, it did. It tasted awful. Initially. Anyways. وَيُفْسِدُهَا شُرْبُهُ لأنه منافي للصلاة. And the prayer is invalidated by drinking. Any. Right? Deliberate or forgetful. Right? ولو رفع رأسه إلى السماء فوقع في حلقه برد أو مطر ووصل إلى جوفه بطلت صلاته. Right? If one raises one's head to the sky and some hail or rain falls into one's throat, one's prayer is invalidated. Right? Why? Because it was avoidable. But if you're just praying regularly and in the prayer some water, some rain gets into your mouth and it was hard to avoid, then that's excused. Right? وَيُفْسِدُهَا التَّنَحْنُحْ بِلَا عُذْرٍ. The prayer is also invalidated by coughing without excuse. Right? As for لما فيه من الحروف, because it produces recognizable letters. وإن كان لعذر كمنعه البلغم من القراءة لا يفسد. If it was out of an excuse, such that it, for example, the one's balgham makes recitation uncomfortable. Mana, right? It does not mean it prevents it, right? Right? منه من قراءة دون is انزعاج. Right? Right? So إن كان لعذر even if it's out of an excuse, right? Right? Even if it's slight, right? لإصلاح صوته أو تحسينه, right? Right? Even if it's for discomfort or to improve your voice or to correct your voice. And also if you cough so that the imam recognizes your mistake, it doesn't break the prayer, because that's established through narrations. Or to tell someone that you're praying, so they're making bad jokes, but you're in ruku', you want to keep the ruku' along. So you go, but you intend there, if you want to be cautious, maslahat as-salah, the interest of the prayer. Right? What ta'fif, go like blowing. كنفخ التراب والتضجر, right? Either to blow dust, so you're in ruku' and you bent really deeply and you notice there's dust where you're prostrating, so it's making the fast sound. والتضجر, like ضجر out of weariness. والأنين, the sound made when there's pain. وهو right? والتأوه, which is to say or oh. والتأوه, which is to say oh. Right? وفيها لغات كثيرة. This can be said in many ways. تمد لا تمد مع التشديد الواو المفتوحة وسكونها الهاء وكسرها. You can say it in many different ways, right? والتأوه وارتفاع بكائه من وجع, and to raise one's voice due to pain or for any worldly reason. وهو أن يحصل به حروف مسموعة, such that there's audible letters, right? Okay, so now there's, right? Al-Tahtawi says that crying that's audible if sounds come from, if letters are made from it, right? ما يحصل به الحروف. Now pay attention to this, eh? وهو ما يحصل به حروف مسموعة, from which audible letters are produced. So I can't act crying, right? So Tahtawi makes a لفتة لطيفة, right? Right? ومرادهم بالجمع ما فوق الواحد وفيه إشارة إلى أن مجرد الصوت غير مفسد خلافا لظاهر right? That the crying to be merely audible doesn't break the prayer. It has to produce discernible letters. That's number one. إذا أمكنه الامتناع عنه, if it would be possible to avoid it. If it's not avoidable, it's beyond your control, then it does not invalidate, right? Such as someone who's sick and they cannot prevent themselves from the pain or the crying, then it is considered like an involuntary response, right? And this whole discussion, right, is, right, unless it's, you can summarize, unless إلا ما لا يمكنه الامتناع عنه, right? And that, except that which you cannot, because لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. So if you're able to avoid it, don't cry. If it overcame you, it is excused from pain. بجسده أو مصيبة بفقد حبيب, or due to a tribulation at the loss of someone beloved. أو مال, or loss of wealth. Some people cry for that, right? قيد الأنين وما بعده لأنه قيد للأنين وما بعده لأنه كلام معنى, because all of these are like speech. Someone who's crying audibly is like saying, I am sad. And they explain that. The fuqaha look at the meaning of things. So you're crying, they say, oh, he's sad. Khalas, understood what's going on, right? Sometimes fuqaha feel they understand everything, but they don't sometimes have complete sympathy. But they have mercy. True fuqaha have mercy. Right? Right? ويفسدها تشميت عاطس. Right? ويفسدها التشميت بالشين المعجمة أفصح من المهملة الدعاء بخير بالخير يعني خطابة عاطس. التشميت is to respond to the one who sneezes and makes dua. بيرحمك الله, right? By saying, to respond to the one sneezing by saying يرحمك الله, because it's addressed لأن إني عندهما, according to Abu Hanifa and Muhammad. That's the relied upon opinion. خلافا لأبي يوسف. Now, things like this, just because you find in the Maraqi it says خلافا لأبي يوسف, does not mean that you can just say, okay, if someone did that a few times, you can just take the position of Abu Yusuf. That's fatwa. That's fatwa. العدول عن الأقوال المصححة لا بد فيه من التثبت. Right? 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 That's what I say. Say لا يحل الإفتاء بالتشهي إجماعا. It's not halal to give legal verdicts by mere whim إجماعا. Okay. And of course, some of it, people distance themselves from ulama, sometimes because of weakness they see in them, and sometimes due to concerted efforts to discredit ilm and the ulama amongst people, right? That's a long effort that has taken place, right? One by internally by worldly, the asl is that dunyawi people don't like the ulama, because the concern of the ulama is the akhirah. Right? So the asl is dunyawi people would have awareness of ulama. The corrupt, even more. Because the corrupt, dunyawi people are at least just, they're sort of, they're maybe on the straight path, but their focus is off the path. But there's someone maybe dunyawi, but they're at least doing their basic obligation. But the corrupt are going the other direction. So these people are at cross purpose with them. The dunyawi find the ulama inconvenient, because they're saying, keep going that way. They're like, we're enjoying ourselves. Right? So they're an annoyance. But the corrupt, they're going that way. The ulama is saying going that way. They're like, leave me alone. So you have to be careful what you listen to from the worldly or the corrupt about the ulama. Right? So you can't give fatwa bit-tashahi. Like you just find an opinion, say, yeah, khalas, let's take that. Even, for students of knowledge, one has to confirm the adab, the proper thing is, these things you take to trustworthy ulama. Can we apply this? Firstly, but the ulama will first check, like, okay, khilaf al-Nabi Yusuf. So they ask you, what did you find about it? So I saw it in the Maraqi. So go with the mu'tamad one, because if that's all you did, mention something about your capacity, right? Someone's really serious, they'd go check, who said that Abu Yusuf said this? They double check, etc. They come with something substantial. They ask, so why do you want to give answer on this? You can't reason. They're not going to say, yeah, sure, because then they're telling you, yeah, whatever opinions you find, do it. And it's not necessarily because that opinion is not followable, because you're not someone to be applying that kind of opinion. So you want to check things like this. فَإِذَا مَا شِئْتَ أَدِّ الثَّمَنَ. If you seek, then pay the price. Allah. وجواب مستفهم عن ند لله سبحانه أي قال هل مع الله إله آخر فجابه المصلي بلا إله إلا الله. Or to answer someone asking you about a partner with Allah. So if someone said, is there any God but Allah? So if you say La ilaha illallah, intending to address them, then no. Right? If you intended dhikr and you're aware that someone is listening, then no, it doesn't break it. Right? So that's why I say وَكُلُّ مَا قُصِدَ بِهِ الْخِطَابِ. Anything where you intend address. Right? Once I went to consult one of my teachers, Shaykh Muhammad Qish, I was really, really stressed, because I was about to embark in a journey, and I had a notion why I was asked to travel. It's actually a good step in my life, but I was just really nervous about it. I didn't know what to do, so I just went to the Shaykh Muhammad Qish. He saw me. I don't know how he knew or intuited, but maybe just because it's something I'd been discussing with him for a while. So he looked at me for the prayer, and it was Maghrib prayer. What he recited in the first rak'ah, khalas, I knew the answer to everything I wanted to answer him. And the second rak'ah just confirmed it. So after the prayer, normally he'd sit down, do his dhikr, but he got up, walked past me, and I was like in the third or fourth, I was several rows behind. He said, smiled at me with a big Cheshire cat smile. Hassalta ala jawabik? Said, do you have the answer that you were looking for? And he went past me, like, where are you going? And he went, I don't know where he did his sunnah, came back, says Nijlis. And they really had nothing to talk to him about. He explained out what he said. Right? But that's not intending address. Intention relates to what drove you to do this. Right? If you intend dhikr, etc., that doesn't. But you keep outside matters outside the prayer. Right? يفسد عندهما خلافا لأبي يوسف. Abu Yusuf said this too does not break the prayer, because it's dhikr. Right? Because it's dhikr. And the prayer, and it's encompassed in the prayer. And it being dhikr makes it of the prayer, regardless of your intention. That's his argument, basically, simplified. وهو يقول إنه ثناء لا يتغير بعزيمته. It is a praise, it's not changed by his resolve. وهما يقولان إنه صار جوابا. But they say, Abu Hanifa and Imam Muhammad, that إنه صار جوابا فيكون متكلما بالمنافي. It became a response. So it is عمل أجنبي عن الصلاة. So that becomes an action foreign to the prayer by its meaning. وخبر سوء بالاسترجاع, and a bad, by hearing a bad news by saying إن لله وإنا إليه راجعون. وسار بالحمد لله, and happy news by saying الحمد لله. جواب خبر. وعجب بلا إله, وسار بالحمد لله, وعجب بلا إله إلا الله, and أو بسبحان الله, and some amazing news by saying لا إله إلا الله or subhanallah. If you intend khitab, if you intend to address, it breaks. ويفسدها كل شيء من القرآن أو غيره قصد به الجواب. Anything, even of the Quran, كيا يحيى خذ الكتاب, such as saying يا يحيى خذ الكتاب لمن طلب كتابا. If someone asks for a book, هل أستعير شرح العمدة? He says يا يحيى خذ الكتاب. Even though it's Quran, you intended address, breaks the prayer. Right? وقوله آتنا غداءنا, bring our meal. لمستفهم عن الإتيان بشيء, that if someone asks, do you need anything? وتلك حدود الله, these are the limits of Allah. فلا تقربوها, so don't come close to them. نهيا لمن استأذن في الأخذ, if someone asks for permission to take something, أريد أن آخذ الكتاب, تلك حدود الله, those are the limits of Allah. فلا تعتدوها, so don't go past. فلا تقربوها. وهكذا, and like that. وإذا لم يرد به الجواب, but if one does not intend to answer, بل أراد الإعلام أنه في الصلاة لا تفسد بالاتفاق, but if one does not intend response, but rather, some said subhanallah, to inform them that you're in the prayer, or maslahat al-salah, the interest of your prayer, لا تفسد بالاتفاق, it doesn't break. ويفسدها رؤية متيمم أو مقتد به ولم يره ماء. The prayer is invalidated by someone who made tayammum, or the one praying behind someone in this state, and وَلَمْ يَرَهُ إِمَامُهُ, and the imam didn't see them, مَاءً. Right? So if the imam saw it, or a follower saw it, because now they all have the ability to use water. قَدَرَ عَلَى اسْتِعْمَالِهِ, but water that you're able to use. قَبْلَ قُعُودِهِ قَدْرَ التَّشَهُدِ, before sitting, to the extent of the tashahhud. And we'll see from the Masail al-Ithna Ashariya. So we'll stop here and address these issues. بإذن الله تعالى. So any questions before we continue?
I had a question about raising the hand to respond to someone saying salam. Would the same also apply, considering the reasoning being that it's amal kathir, what if someone nodded in reply? Would that nullify the prayer?
Yes.
Would that be because it's considered amal kathir, or would there be a different reason?
كل ما قصد به الخطاب, you intended to address somebody.
So So when we covered this in the Sunan as-Salah, when we mentioned that someone could raise their hand to tell someone that they're praying if they're making noise or something like that, wouldn't that be sort of the same thing, that it's like telling?
Yeah. So no. So the qiyas, the direct line of legal reasoning. If you raise your hands to greet somebody, it breaks the prayer. But that's ثابت نصا. But it's على خلاف القياس. So the qiyas is كل ما قصد به الخطاب فهو مفسد للصلاة. Everything that, because it's كلام الناس. كل ما كان من جنس كلام الناس لا يجوز في الصلاة. Anything that's from كلام الناس is not allowed in the prayer. Right? And every action that conveys addressing another is like كلام الناس معنى. So that's the asl. Something that is ثابت, we don't deny it, but كل ما ثبت على خلاف الأصل فغيره لا يقاس عليه. So it is established in the Sunnah that you can greet someone with an ishara مفهمة, but for greeting. But you can't do other things, right? Unless it's in the maslahat as-salah. You could point to someone to move forward, because that's maslahat as-salah. It's not worldly address, right? But if someone brings food and they say, where do I put it? And you point to the counter. Someone says, now we have the sofa. You point where the sofa is. That's worldly speech. Just finish your prayer quickly and then have whatever conversations you want. If it's really critical, someone's carrying a heavy sofa, then the ahkam of breaking prayer would apply. You just said Allahu Akbar and the movers come in. And each one's carrying something. So you don't pray and tell people where to put different things. What do? Break your prayer. Because now, they're bringing in, they charge by the minute. Every minute we're in your house, we charge $5. So just break your prayer, tell them what to do, and we'll see the العذر المبيح لقطع الصلاة. So the ishara that's mentioned, that we'll see that it's permitted, but it doesn't break the prayer, but it's makruh al-ishara fi as-salah. It's makruh, but that's khilaf al-asl la yuqas alayhi. So any other movements by which you intend to address people are not allowed. But picking up a child, or moving a child, etc. This can be maslahat as-salah. Okay, so we'll stop there, inshallah.